Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches. Este es Luis Alberto Jovel de luisjovel.com, trayéndole una vez más un estudio acerca de la palabra de Dios. Y en esta ocasión estoy trayendo a un joven que vive en Alemania, pero él es americano o como le dirían a él, gringo. Ben Stanhope, que sus padres fueron misioneros en Costa Rica y en la República Dominicana, pero parece que él ya no se acuerda nada de su español. No español, Ben, no español.
No.
No. I was saying that your parents were missionaries, but you have forgotten your Spanish.
Correct.
So Ben, can you tell us something about you? I mean, your background, where you're from. I already said that you're gringo, so but you're actually living somewhere else in the planet. So can you tell us a bit of what your background?
Sure. I'm from Kentucky
Hmm.
in USA, but currently I'm living in Germany, uh, attending the attending university here. I have a bachelor's degree from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I worked as a Garrett Fellow there for a while, but currently I'm a master's student at Hamburg University at the Center for the Study of Manuscript Cultures,
Hmm.
which is it's actually a really cool and interesting institute. They study manuscripts, but the idea is to have people from all over the world from different backgrounds. So you have Sanskrit scholars, and you have
Hmm.
Chinese scholars, and you have Judaic scholars and Islamic manuscriptologists, and they're all in the same building. And the idea is that with all this cross pollination with these fields, uh, they can help lift up all the fields mutually. So that's what I'm working on right now. I'm right at the end stages of it. I'm doing my master's thesis on Hebrew seals, which I assume we'll be talking about a little bit.
Yes. Hmm. And family-wise, are you married or single?
Uh,
I don't know.
I'm married,
Yes. Okay.
but no kids yet,
No kids yet. Okay. Well,
and one cat.
one
So
cat. Oh,
that's that situation.
well, I have a cat too. My daughter, I asked for grandchildren, but they had given me a cat as a grandchild. So there you go. I'm a granddad, but something else. Well, well, I'm very glad to have you on this program. As I have said, that this is program mainly geared to Latin American people, and I'm happy because I'm happy that I interviewed Michael Heiser um, before, and you and I and Matthias, who managed for us to have this interview. He is also a fan of Michael Heiser, and you have done
Yes.
a lot of videos that touch on many things that are not talked about at church, which deal with Bible background, which Bible with the background that really informs the reader. And I'm gonna have a little bit of Aussie, Aussie, the reader mother. That's how we talk here. Informs the reader how to read scripture, and that's the interest in this thing. And I like to go right into it. And the first question that I have is has to deal with chaos language and monsters in the Bible. See, regarding young Earth, some young Earth creationists interpret the creatures Leviathan and Behemot mentioned in the Book of Job as the ways in which the Bible describes presently extinct animals, such as the Plesiosaurus, which is a marine reptile, or Brachiosaurus, a dinosaur. Ben, you have talked about the cultural background of Leviathan and Behemoth in your videos. Could you explain why the young Earth interpretation is incorrect, which is many viewers don't like to hear this, but I think they need to hear why the interpretation maybe not incorrect, but may not represent the ancient Near Eastern view of creation.
Right. I guess the reason why it's important is that there's a tremendous amount of ancient theology that's embedded in creatures like Leviathan. A lot of symbolism, millennia of symbolism is embedded within Leviathan. And when you do say what answers in Genesis or young Earth creationists generally do and explain him as a dinosaur, you end up missing out on all of all of that meaning that's being telegraphed in the passage. So the main passage where Leviathan is mentioned, I start with him because he's the easier case in terms of cultural background, what we know about him. He's mentioned in Job 41, and I'm not gonna read through the whole passage, but it's a very long poem about this creature it's clearly reptilian. It's associated with the water. The thing that's most interesting about it, which creationists, young Earth creationists, they're familiar with this. On multiple occasions, it says just point blank that he breathes fire. So I'm sure you're aware, as I am, that there's a lot of young Earth creationist websites and Answers in Genesis that will claim that ancient reptiles could literally breathe fire.
Yes.
Which is, it sounds a little bit absurd, but the one, so I decided I wanted to check them on this a couple years ago, so I decided to do a search for the word Leviathan in the Bible, and I found among the references to Leviathan that exist, there's one in particular that I noticed that young Earth creationists had never commented on before. Like I did a literature review of them and I tried to find reference to this passage and I never have. It's Psalm 74 verse 14. They're aware that it exists, but what they're not aware of, because most of them don't read Hebrew, is that in the Hebrew, grammatically, it says Leviathan has multiple heads.
Like a hydra.
So the phrase is Reshe Leviathan, which is plural construct of heads. So plural, and then singular, Leviathan. So you've got a hydra. So that's when things started to begin to unravel for me.
And let me point out that you don't need necessarily to know Hebrew, but you at least need to use a good commentary to point these things out.
There are plenty of commentaries to point this out. If you just go to a commentary of someone that knows it, if they had done that, they would have noticed this.
So this is, and a lot of people from Answers in Genesis, they're academics. I mean, they have PhDs, they're physicists, biologists. But
yeah, I should say, when I say most of them didn't know Hebrew, especially at the time when Young Earth Publishing was quite popular, like in the late 90s, I mean that technically. I did a literature survey of all the major published works on by Young Earth creationists. I checked their backgrounds and I saw these guys are all scientists for the most part. There's a few that know Hebrew, but I think the fact that they didn't is why this aspect of Leviathan was missed. That he, in this passage, and I think probably in a couple more, he has multiple heads. So add to that the fire breathing, and it starts to sound a little bit absurd.
So this is you said Psalm what? Can you give me the Psalm?
Psalm 74, verse 14 in particular. But
yes,
Psalm 74 is a creation hymn.
Yes. Or
a creation psalm written after the Judeans were taken into exile in Babylon, which is very interesting because the Babylonian creation myth, if you're familiar with it, it's recorded in a text called the Numa Elish.
Yes.
It's the story about how the god Marduk defeats a chaos dragon named Tiamat, and then he creates the world from her severed body. And what Psalm 74 is doing is it's taking that myth and it's applying it to Yahweh and saying, no, it was actually Yahweh who created the heavens and the earth. And it talks about he defeated the chaos dragon. He crushed the heads of Leviathan. So instead of this Mesopotamian Babylonian version of Leviathan called Tiamat, they just put in their West Semitic version of this myth, this creature called Leviathan.
So in a sense, the Hebrews, the Jews of the time, because they're in exile now, they are appropriating a story and putting it, and giving it their, I'm gonna say their spin, the way they understand it, and said, no, this is Babylonians have a similar story, but we have, as Hebrews, we want to keep our story. And we put it down on writing, so we differentiate between us and them. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, this is something that biblical authors do all the time, where it actually, it scares people theologically, but it shouldn't. where they'll take the name Cloud Rider, for example, in the Bible. He
Yes.
always called the Cloud Rider, and Jesus eventually calls himself the Cloud Rider. That is originally a title for the god Baal. What the biblical authors do is they take it and say, no, it's actually our God who deserves this great title. And that's something that happened all the time in the ancient world of the Bible in the ancient Near East. But so to give you a parallel text, the chaos dragon isn't just in Hebrew culture. It's not just in Babylonian culture. It was essentially universal across the ancient Near East. In Egypt, the permutation was this god called Apophis that the sun god Re has to defeat every morning.
Yes.
The text that's most interesting, I think, is a little bit north of Israel at a place called Ugarit, which they essentially speak the same language as the Hebrews, except it's just an older form of it. It's kind of like Shakespearean English versus modern English would be the difference.
Or Spanish and Portuguese, I guess, because I can talk to Portuguese people. I mean, like
Yeah,
80%.
very very similar to that sort of a thing. But so Ugarit collapsed. Their civilization collapsed in the 12th century BC. So their texts are, for the most part, older than the biblical texts, the ones that mention Leviathan at least. So I'll go ahead and read you one really quick. It's from a text called KTU 1:5. And this is a text addressed to Baal, essentially. You smote Letanu, the fleeing serpent, annihilated the twisting serpent, the dominant one who has 7 heads. So here you have a multi-headed dragon. It's called the twisting serpent and the fleeing serpent. And the Ugaritic words here are identical to Hebrew titles that are applied to Leviathan. So in the one case, at Ugarit, he was called Letanu. It's the same consonants, LTN, that form the base of the word. In Hebrew, it's Leviathan, same consonant, LTN. But I'll read to you from Isaiah 27:1. And that day Leviathan will punish with his greatly fierce and mighty sword, Leviathan the fleeing serpent. Again, it's the same Hebrew title. Leviathan the twisting serpent, same Hebrew title. And he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. So clearly what you have going on here is the myth of Baal defeating this creature, Letanu. It was associated with this idea that this creature was an embodiment of chaos. It was a symbol of chaos, and Baal had to defeat it on a regular basis in order for the created order to be maintained, in order for it to keep going. So this is why you have, for example, passages in the Bible where Isaiah will talk about Leviathan. God destroyed Leviathan in the act of creating the world, which doesn't make any sense if he's a dinosaur. It's a little odd. Why would God be beating up a poor plesiosaur at the creation account? But then it says, but he'll actually slay Leviathan on the last day at the eschaton.
And I guess that's for people who get very worried about. In Spanish we have some people who like to say, the Bible plagiarizes everything. I said, no. I mean, do you know the background? I mean, like you said, but Baal had to kill this creature every day, while in the Hebrew thinking, no, this is gonna be done in the last day. It's a total different concept. It's similar.
Idea,
it's a similar but yet different concept.
There's a famous Ugaritologist, Ola Vikander, who's written an article on this similarity between Baal and Letanu at Ugaritic text. And he has this quote that I love where he talks about, it's not that Judaism was stealing Northwest Semitic culture. It is Northwest Semitic culture. This is like indigenous. This belief goes as far back as you can imagine within their own culture. It's something that they were familiar with. And they use it in the same way that other people in the ancient Near East used it, as this sort of mythic, symbolic way of communicating this idea that God is the king of the created order, and he defeats, he holds down, he restrains this chaos dragon, which is a representation of aquatic chaos, and by doing so, the created order is sustained. So, like I said, you lose all of that if you just think this is Job's firsthand account of a dinosaur. So let's see. I think I've written down here a culmination of the reasons why I don't think it's a dinosaur.
Okay.
So in Psalm 74, God's defeat of Leviathan precedes the creation of the world. If literal, this would contradict the creation account in Genesis 1 because there's no mention at all of the slaying of a dragon in Genesis 1, which is essentially the definitive creation account in Hebrew cosmology. Isaiah says Leviathan will be killed again at the eschaton, which doesn't make any sense if it's a dragon. Like, what does God have a plesiosaur out in the ocean that he's saving on the last day that he can just punish?
You're in Europe. I mean, you could go to the Scotland and maybe Loch Ness, somewhere there. You never know.
Yeah, that's what the creationists, the younger creationists, would usually tell me.
Yeah, well, there you go.
But I don't think he's going to be multi-headed and breathing fire.
And that's the thing. I've seen so many. I mean, I've read of people who said there cannot be an animal who can breathe out fire unless it has some sort of like steel in their throat or something, because it'll just melt.
Right, and I've seen all of those explanations online to try to scientifically explain how this could be possible, that a literal creature could be breathing fire, but I don't think it's a proper way of looking at the text at all. We actually have a few pictorial depictions of chaos dragons from, I'm thinking of one from Sumeria off the top of my head, where it shows fire coming out from this seven-headed dragon's back.
But it's from the back.
So it was part of the mythic framework of the ancient Near East.
Mm-hmm. But so young creationists are wrong. I mean, plainly wrong, because they don't take into account the cosmology of ancient Hebrew and ancient Near Eastern people.
Correct. That's the short of it. And you asked also about Behemoth.
Yes.
I'll be a little bit shorter with this.
He's as big as 50 mountains. That's what. And imagine an animal that size. I mean, in Australia, mountains are very short, but in Europe and in other continents, mountains are huge.
So with Behemoth, the first thing I did is I looked at the passage, the Hebrew of the passage, and first thing that jumps out at you is it has poetic parallel structure. So you have passages like, "Behold, his strength is in his loins," then it repeats it, "and his power is in the muscles of his belly. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs are like bars of iron." Sandwiched between those two passages I just read is this passage. "He extends his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together." So that's the primary passage that a lot of people point to try to argue that this is a brachiosaurus. He has a tail like a cedar, because elephants don't have tails like cedars, hippos don't have tails like cedars. So what's going on here? First of all, this passage is right next to the passage that describes Leviathan. Leviathan's in chapter 41 of Job, and Behemoth is in chapter 40 of Job. So they're essentially brothers. They're written about in the same poetic structure. They're parallel creatures, is what I'm getting at. So because we know from other ancient Near Eastern texts that contain reference to Leviathan that he's essentially this sort of mythic chaos creature, this chaos deity, if you want to use that term, the most natural explanation is that Behemoth should be interpreted in the same way, that it's some sort of supernatural representation of chaos. And in particular, this passage, he extends his tail like a cedar. I don't know how to do this, like just drop this on you, but the word tail in ancient Near Eastern literature often refers to the male anatomy. So
yes, I mean, that'll be it.
This verse is written in poetic parallelism. The phrase "the sinews of his thighs are knit together," which the King James versions King James Version translates that verse, the sinews of his stones are knit together. That word thighs is in Aramaic. It's a euphemism for the testicles. So because these two words are parallel, that word tail has to be a parallel for the testicles, which tells you that it's a euphemism for the male anatomy, which actually makes a tremendous amount of sense of the verb that's in that verse. So a lot of people have a really hard time, scholars have had a hard time translating this because there's this, the verb that refers to the tail, what the action that the tail is doing. It's the Hebrew word chafetz, which it can mean extending, it can mean stiffening, it can mean desire or delight across multiple biblical passages. What's so cool about this translation, taking this as a euphemism for the male anatomy, is that it instantly, all that clicks together poetically, all that full range of meaning. You also have terms, let's see, the phrase "his strength is in his loins." If you go look up that phrase, strengthen one's loins, that's sort of an idea in Hebrew passages like Genesis 49 verse 3, Deuteronomy 21 verse 17. It refers to sexual virility. It'll refer to, like a patriarch, his children are the strength of his loins. That's sort of an idea. So again, it's a sexual reproductive euphemism. And then you have the fact that in post-biblical Hebrew and Aramaic, this word for tail in this passage, it also refers to the male appendage. So what is behemoth? The word behemoth, etymologically, it comes from a pretty mundane, pretty common Hebrew word, behemah, which is a common word for cattle. And then the word the ending oath is just an intensification of that word. So in my opinion, it's a sort of super ox. And this praising of its sexual virility, which we find so strange in our culture and inappropriate, like in ancient Near Eastern culture, that's pretty standard for that type of a metaphor in reference to nature.
Well, yes, because there's still some paintings and some amulets that they find that they have like a piece of man, but with a
Exactly. This
extremely
blows modern people
big.
away when they go to museums and see all this stuff.
Yeah, and this is gonna sound weird to our listeners here and those who are reading the translation, but the male appendage is this amulet with a male figure with a humongous appendage is supposed to wear off demons and bad spirits. So this is
And I could talk about this a lot, just a lot of the symbolism from the ancient world, like the obelisk and how that relates to the Egyptian mythology of the male appendage. But in the ancient world, there's it wasn't as strange as it would be now to make these sorts of poetic connections. But what's so cool about translating this behemoth as a super ox is when you go to the passage that I read you earlier that describes the Ugaritic Leviathan, there's an ox right next to it. It's a super ox, just like in the Hebrew poetry, how there's an ox right next to it. I'll go ahead and read you the passage. Surely I lifted up the dragon. I destroyed the twisting serpent, the tyrant with the 7 heads. I destroyed Arshu, beloved of El. I put an end to El's calf, Attic. So you had this creature called the calf of God, essentially, within Ugaritic mythology. We don't know much about it, but in the ancient Near East, for example, you have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which talks about, there's this whole episode where a goddess becomes angry with Gilgamesh and his friend, and she sends this giant calf of God not calf of God, but she sends this giant
ox
bull of heaven in order to kill them. And for example, one passage I pulled from the Gilgamesh epic. It says that this bull of heaven drank water of a river in great slurps, which with each slurp it used up 1 mile of the river, but its thirst was not satisfied. And you could parallel that maybe with the description of Behemoth in verse 23. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he is not frightened. He is confident, though Jordan rushes against his mouth. So you can see a lot of I think it's the most superior framework for understanding this passage is that Behemoth was a type of super ox mythological creature within ancient Northwest Semitic religion. And Job is using him alongside Leviathan to sort of communicate God's dominion over chaos in the created order.
In land,
So he's
both
gone.
sea and land as well.
Yes. That's something that I've wondered is it possible that Behemoth might actually be a representation of chaos of the earthly creation, while Leviathan is a representation of chaos of the sea, like the chaos of the sea.
Yes.
But unfortunately, the text at present, we don't have enough information to say for sure. What I can say is that there's never any verse like even close that says that he has a long neck, that he has scales like a reptile. Nothing resembling a brachiosaurus.
And this is something about dragons that because in young creationists they believe that there was a dragon or something, but the dragons that we see that we imagine like Saint George killing the dragon. And I'm talking about Anglo-Saxon view of seeing things. We have in Latin America we have Quetzalcoatl in Mexico. That's a similar serpent with flies. But the dragon in China, I mean, that dragon is a cow. It's a lot of animals put together, which is a different framework of dragon.
You know, there's an awesome collection of books. Some of my favorite that I've ever read. It's written by a scholar from Stanford University named Adrienne Mayor, and she's written books called I think the first one was called The First Fossil Hunters in Greek and Rome, and then she wrote another one on ancient Native Americans. She talks about South America as well, fossil hunting in ancient Native America. One thing I think people don't realize is that for thousands and thousands of years, people have been excavating dinosaur fossils, especially like in the American West, especially in China. Oh my gosh, it's like an indigenous part of their medicine is to be drinking these dragon fossils. And I've read reports even like in recent years. I think I read an article from 2017 where a paleontologist was getting reports that these people in this native Chinese village were digging up dinosaur fossils and they were drinking them in their tea because they thought they were dragon bones and that it would give them supernatural powers that would help them with their ailments. And they literally, these people in China still living today literally thought there were dragons flying around in the sky because obviously, look, they're skeletons. They're in the ground. You can see them. So
they died recently.
I think that's the answer I give to creationists. Why is it that you have dragons all over the world? That's part of the answer is because people have been digging up dinosaur fossils for. I mean, this didn't just start, say, in the 1800s. People started discovering these things.
Yeah, like I said, there's also a native Mexican Quetzalcoatl is a Mexican mythical creature, which is so well. And it was going on only 1,500 years ago. I mean, only 500 years ago, 600 years ago. So there you go. Anyway, I think we have. I'd like to round up this question saying that then young Earth creationists people err because they don't take the cosmological view of the original writers, and also because they want to impose an post-enlightenment understanding of creation. That'll be
correct.
That'll be right. Yeah.